Second Lieutenant Larry Knowles, United States Army, Korea. Larry's one of my Korean veterans featured in my film Korea: The Forgotten War, which is aired here on the Voices of History YouTube channel and my radio station. I interviewed Larry in Longmont, Colorado, April 7, 2007. He was 22 years old when he went to Korea in July of 1952. He was 78 years old in this interview, and I believe he's still with us today in his 90s. So he tells a great story. He was a tank commander, a platoon leader in Korea. He worked with the M46 Patton tanks. There's pictures after this introduction of some of those tanks. And he served with the 40th Infantry Division, 140th Tank Battalion, B Company. I also see pictures of him with C Company, so I think he went from one company to another. But he is a combat veteran, folks, from Korea, and I'm just so happy to share his story with you today. I want to thank Michael Sarofsky for sponsoring Larry's story. Michael, thank you again for stepping forward, and I appreciate you, sir. Thank you for helping me support my veterans through my efforts and my work that I've done, and helping me with these interviews. So Michael, I really appreciate it. God bless you. Larry Knowles, folks, on the YouTube Voices of History channel, and he'll be on my Voices of History radio channel. Folks, if you'd like to sponsor a story, there's information in the video description below the video and on my website, larrycappetto.com. There's a link that says Sponsor a Vet. Click on it. You'll see pictures of my veterans, and just include the name of the veteran that you'd like to sponsor. If you'd like to donate to my work, it'd be greatly appreciated. There's information always in the comment section below the video. Without further ado, I present to you now Larry Knowles. He tells, like I say, tells an amazing story of what he went through in Korea, and one of my few tank commander stories, especially the Patton tank in Korea. So this is history, folks. Happy to share it with you today. Subscribe to this channel. Share these videos. Let's keep this thing going. God bless you. Tell me what year, Larry, you went over to Korea.
Okay, I went over in July of 1952.
Okay, and Army?
Yes, I was in the Army. I was a second lieutenant. I got my commission at ROTC at the University of Georgia, and I was called on active duty a couple of months after I graduated. And I was in the States for not quite a year before I was shipped over. And at that point in the war, we were going in as individual replacements. They weren't sending in new units, so it was a replacement. So I landed at Pusan on the 16th of July of 1952.
Okay, so you were how old at that time?
Let's see, I was 22.
Second lieutenant.
Yeah, I was just a young fella.
Have you ever been around combat before?
Oh, no.
Yeah, this is first time.
No, my dad had been in World War II in the Seabees and spent a lot of time at Guadalcanal. And he told me about some of the bombings that he had underwent with the Japanese, but I had never been in combat before.
So how old are you now, 76?
78.
78, okay. Okay. So tell me about being in Korea. I mean, we're fighting the Chinese over there?
Yes, by the time I got over there, the front had stabilized, and most of it was up in North Korea. It was a 155-mile front running from one coast to the other coast of the Korean Peninsula. And I was in 3 different units. It's sort of like the military. They train you for one thing and they put you in something else. But eventually I ended up on the front with a tank battalion. The first time I saw combat was the Battle of White Horse Mountain, which took place in October of 1952, and it was near a place called Chorwan. There was a place called the Iron Triangle, where a lot of really awful fighting took place before I got there. And Kumwa was one leg of the triangle, Chorwan was the other, and Pyongyang up in North Korea, which was enemy territory, was the third leg of the triangle.
Tell me what unit you're with again, what army?
I was in the 40th Infantry Division, and it was the 140th Tank Battalion, and I was in B Company.
And you're a second lieutenant.
Yeah, I was a platoon leader. I had 5 tanks, 5 M46 Patton tanks, and each tank had a crew of 5, so there were 25 of us in the platoon, plus I had a Jeep and a Jeep driver, so there was 26 total.
So tell me a little bit about the Chinese fighting, what they were like as an enemy.
Well, they were they were pretty fanatical, and luckily by the time I got there, the front had stabilized, and we knew that the enemy, the Chinese, were to the north of us. There weren't any behind us, and we had almost like World War I fortifications with trenches that we had dug, and we lived in bunkers. And so we would shoot at them and they would shoot at us. And at that time, the peace talks were taking place, and our higher command had been given orders not to launch any all-out offensives. And the only thing that we could really do was if the Chinese attacked us, we could repel them. So it was pretty much World War I type warfare the year that I was over there. With the front didn't move very much at all.
So what's it like being in combat? I mean, is there fear in combat, or is it before or after you have the fear?
Well, there's both. You're scared to death when you go up to on the hill, is what we used to call it, because I remember when I was moving up through the different replacement units to get to my final assignment, I would see hospital trains moving south, and they had a lot of GIs that had been wounded, and you'd see, young fellows with their heads all bandaged up and their arms in a sling, and And that was a sobering thought, especially if you're a young guy and you know, nobody's ever tried to kill you and you've never tried to kill anybody yourself. So it was scary. It was very, very frightening. And then once I got up on the line and I got shelled, pretty much the Chinese would fire 120 millimeter mortar rounds at us, and we'd be firing our 90 millimeter tank cannon at them. And when those rounds start coming in, it's the most terrifying experience that I had ever had. I mean, it's if no one has ever been close to a loud explosion, it's a terrible thing. And but while you're actually in combat, things are moving so fast that you don't have much time to sit around and think about, am I scared or not? But then when it's over and things calm down, you really become frightened. I mean, you start shaking and realizing, gee, that was a close call. So.
So you're over there fighting for your country. A lot of people don't know a lot about Korea, you know? You were over there in the 50s fighting, and did you feel like you had a strong sense of purpose for what you were doing there?
Well, yes, I did, because back then the big threat to the United States was the Soviet Union. And there was this, you know, when the Iron Curtain went down right after World War II in about 1948, the Russians or the Soviets had become our major threat. And they had so many more troops than we did, but we thought that we had better weapons. And of course we had the nuclear bomb until they got it. So times were not as bad as during World War II, but it was pretty tense because we were old enough to realize what combat was like. We'd seen the films of World War II. So we had this threat of communism and of them trying to take over the world. And so I volunteered. I mean, just by the fact that I signed up for ROTC, I agreed that I'd serve my country if they wanted me. And they wanted me. But I felt that I was accomplishing something, and I had this dread of something happening to the people in the United States, especially to my wife and my parents. And I did not want any war happening on United States soil, so I felt this is the least that I can do. My dad had fought for his country in World War II, and I was at the age where a war came along, and it was up to a lot of people like myself to do what we could.
Did you fight at Pork Chop Hill?
No, but I was very close to it. I was at when I was at Chorwan later on, in March and April of 1953, Pork Chop Hill was just off to my left flank, and I could see and hear the fighting going on there because they had a terrific battle there, I think about March of '53. And I was just far enough along the front where I wasn't right there. But I could see the explosions. Our Air Force was coming over and bombing relentlessly. Flares were being dropped. It just made the nighttime almost seem like day with these brilliant flares that we would use to illuminate the battlefield.
Did you sustain a lot of casualties in your unit during your time in Korea?
Luckily, not a lot of casualties, but there was one situation that I'd mentioned to you over the telephone where there were 4 of us in my tank, and I'm the only one that survived.
Tell me what happened and where you were.
Okay, this happened on the 19th of January of 1953, and it was at a place, near a place called Mongdong-ni, which was up in North Korea, not too far from the Punch Bowl to our right or east, and to our left was Chorwan and White Horse Mountain. So we were sort of in a little place in between. And I had a platoon of tanks up on the line, and we were given direct fire support to a Republic of Korea infantry battalion. And so I had liaison with officers from that unit. And especially at night when they would go out on patrol, they would call for tank fire if they ran into the Chinese communists, and we would have predetermined targets. We'd know about where their patrol was going, and if they needed help, they would call us and they'd give me a code for what target they wanted me to fire at, and so we would do that. Well, besides that, a decision was made by higher headquarters that we would try having South Korean artillery officers in our tanks that would be directing their artillery fire, like being a forward observer. So this January day, the 19th of January, there were 2 Korean officers that came up to my bunker, and we got into my tank. It was my driver and the 2 Koreans and myself, and we pulled into our firing position, and I started showing them how our tank radio worked, and so they started talking with their artillery unit. And so this went on for probably about half an hour, and then all at once there was an explosion out in front of my tank. And later on I found out that it was a 120 millimeter mortar, Soviet mortar round that had landed, exploded. And the Koreans panicked, and they wanted to get out of the tank, and I talked to them in. I said, one could speak a little English, the other one none at all, so we had a language problem. So I told them to stay down in the tank, and but they really were freaking out. So I called on my intercom to my driver to start up the engine and back out, because I could see that we weren't going to get much more done. Well, there was no response. So I looked down, and in a tank, the tank commander is up in the turret, and the driver is down lower and up to the left in front of him. So I looked down to see why he wasn't doing anything, and I saw that his name was Bill Avery, a wonderful man. He was slumped over, and he was bleeding profusely from his head. And I could see that, you know, that he had been wounded seriously. So something had to be done. Then another mortar round landed 3 feet in back of my tank, and I thought we'd taken a direct hit because the concussion was just terrible. So I got out of the tank to run to my bunker to get another soldier to help me to get this tank out of the position so that the Chinese couldn't see us and they couldn't hit us then. So while I was going into my bunker, the two Koreans got out of the tank, and they were right by the side of it, and another mortar round came in and it wounded both of them. So when I came out with my gunner, we saw the Koreans lying on the ground, and we knew that my driver was wounded in the tank. So I got in the assistant driver's seat, which was right parallel with the driver, and my gunner, Dave Green, got up in the turret, and so I started the engine, and he directed me to back out. Well, we were right up on the top of a mountain, and if we had backed too far, the tank would have tumbled down several hundred feet down the side of the mountain. So it was really a tense situation. So I was slowly backing the tank up, and he was telling me, to turn right or to turn left a little bit. And we were worried about rolling over the wounded Koreans also, because they were off to the side. So eventually he guided me safely out of there, and we got back where the Chinese couldn't see us, and they stopped firing. So then we carried Avery out of the tank and into the bunker and called the MASH, a helicopter. And they came within about 20 minutes. But it looked like that Bill had died because he had been wounded. A piece of shrapnel had gone right into one of his eyes. And so he died. And then the two Koreans had been killed that had gotten out of the tank. So I felt so sad and sorry about these losses, and I felt so thankful that I had been spared, because out of the four of us, I was the only one that was still living, and I hadn't even been wounded. I'd had the hell scared out of me by the concussions, but that was the closest that I came to being killed over there.
So you were in a tank?
Yes.
So you were a tank commander?
Yes.
What kind of tanks?
Well, it was an M46 Patton, and this was a revision of a tank that had been used in the latter part of World War II, which was the M26. And it had a 90 millimeter cannon. It's a marvelous fire direction system. And we, early in the war, our tanks were no match for the Soviet T-34 tanks that the North Koreans were using. But by the time we got bigger tanks over there, like the kind that I had, we could outslug a T-34. And in one of the positions where I was, there were about 3 of them that had been knocked out earlier in the war, just sitting out there in the battlefield. So.
Are these memories like a long time ago, or is it like yesterday?
Well, some of both, but I wrote letters to my wife about every day, and she did the same to me, and we kept those letters. And so later on, well, a few years back, we prepared sort of a manuscript for a book we might publish someday. And so that brought these events much closer to my mind, because I could read it and then I could recall, well, yeah, that's right. And then besides what I wrote, these other things happened. And I didn't want to worry my wife too much about, me being up in combat. She was pregnant at the time, so But
you guys wrote back and forth?
yes,
You wrote back and forth?
yeah, just about every day. And she saved all of my letters, and I saved all of hers.
How important was that for your morale to get those letters?
Oh, well, if you've ever been in the military, and you would know the significance of mail call. I mean, that was your link with loved ones and with the wonderful situation that you had left behind. And so it was, I can't speak enough how high letters would raise our morale. And sometimes I'd have maybe 4 or 5 letters that would all come in together. And you
I'd
know.
like to see some copies of those sometime. Maybe you can make some photocopies of some of them and mail them to me, because I'd like to even use them in the film.
Yeah, I could do that, yes, because I have
Give
them.
me a really nice color copy of the original letter, like go to Kinko's or Quick Copy and have them make a color copy of each side of the letters. That'd be better than a black and white copy. I'd like to see it if they were colored paper, you know what I'm saying?
Well, I could scan. I've got a
You
scanner,
know how to do the scanning?
and I can scan it and send it to your email, and it to be in color.
Okay, I'll give you my card before we leave today. That's great.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're in a
Yeah.
tank. How many months are you in Korea total?
It was almost a year. I arrived on the 16th of July, and I left on the 12th of June the next year.
53.
Yes, of 53.
Did the war end in July?
Yes. It ended a little over a month after I started home. It ended on the 27th of July of 1953. And
Wasn't the start June 25th or something in 1950, or do you know?
yeah, that's right. It was June 25, 1950.
And a lot of men were killed in Korea.
That's right. Yeah, especially the early part of the war, when we really weren't prepared. And then we had another awful situation when the Chinese communists came into the war in November of 1951, because they just overwhelmed us with manpower, even with our air force, and all of the high-tech weapons that we had compared to what they had. They would just overrun you. And so I felt so sorry for the fellows that were there before we really mobilized. And it was a wonderful feeling by the time I got there to see all of these units, all of these soldiers, everybody doing their part to support the relatively few people that are up on the line on combat. As I recall, it took like about 10 people to support one man up on the front, because you have supply people, you have medical people, you have administration, all kind of things to run an army. And
Larry, tell me about the cold of the winter of 52, 53, and how that affected you. Was it really cold?
well, I was up on top of a mountain, at the same place where I was almost killed. And I think the elevation at the top of that mountain was, about 3,000 feet. Over there, they measured it in meters. But I had my wife send me a thermometer from the States, and so I put that thermometer out side of our bunker, and the coldest that it got was 40 below zero. And but I remember when we were moving up to the front, it was so cold. I didn't care whether I lived or died. Now that's pretty cold. We had good equipment. We had gloves, But you know, even with the gloves, your hands would get so cold that you couldn't move your fingers very well. And you were having to work a radio, and so you have to take your gloves off to work the radio. And I remember just thinking, oh, I'm so cold. I've never been this cold before. And it made me have a real resolve when I got back home that I never wanted to get cold again. Yeah.
What the heck you living around here for then?
Well, there's a lot more. There's a big difference in living out in the cold and being in a building or a home that's heated, or in a car that's heated. So
I know some men who sleep with their socks on still because they were so cold in Korea, and who got frostbite.
yeah.
And they live in Florida now. But anyways,
Well, by the time I got there, the Army had issued us this
yeah.
wonderful boot. We called them Mickey Mouse boots because they were great big black things. And all you had to do was just wear regular socks, cotton socks. And if you walked around, your feet would feel uncomfortably damp, but not cold. It could be minus 40 degrees out, but those Mickey Mouse boots would protect your feet. Now, if you punctured the boot, then you were in a world of hurt because then it would lose its insulation quality. But it was such an improvement over the leather combat boots that we had earlier. And we did have really good equipment. The quartermaster people took care of us.
What was maybe the hardest thing you had to do or in Korea? What was the most difficult thing or difficult task or situation you encountered in Korea?
Well, when my driver, Bill Avery, was killed, and that was, when you lose a comrade, it's just, it's the worst of the worst. I had some other friends, you know, that were killed, but I wasn't around them. But this was something that was, he was closer to me than you are to me right now in that tank. And so that was just terrible. I had other close calls, but not any as close as that.
So your perception of the war is through a periscope or whatever you look through outside the tank, right?
Well, my binoculars, usually the responsibility of the tank commander was to identify targets and let the gunner know where the target was and then tell him to start firing. So a lot of times I would have my head exposed outside of the tank, and I'd have binoculars that I'd be looking at, because the enemy was maybe 3,000 yards away from me, and I wanted to keep them farther away than that if possible, because we had our trenches dug on the top of a mountain, and the Chinese were to the north of us, and they had done the same thing.
Yeah.
And so at night, we'd send out patrols, not the tankers, but the infantry. We'd send out patrols in the dark to probe, to find out what the Chinese were up to, and the Chinese would do the same thing. And so by the time I got over there, that's where most of our casualties were people who had gone out on patrol.
Boy. So how are you're shooting a 90 millimeter?
Yes.
Who's reloading that thing?
Well, a tank crew, back then anyway, consisted of 5 men. And you had the tank commander up in the top of the turret, and then the gunner was right down almost between the tank commander's legs, where he had a telescope where he could see whatever the target was. Then off to the tank commander's left was the loader, and he would put the ammunition into the gun. And then you had a driver and an assistant driver, so that you had the crew of 5. So it was a real team effort. So
Did you ever get hit with enemy fire on your tank?
the closest I came was when that round landed 3 feet in back of my tank. One time later on, in May, when I was at Panmunjom, or near Panmunjom, one of my tanks got a direct hit from a Chinese rocket, but it didn't penetrate the tank. But it gouged out a big hunk of metal on the side of it, and it really scared us. I mean, those rockets are something else, because you hear them. You don't hear a mortar round, because it goes way up high and it comes down. But those rockets scream. And
How about other tanks? Were they blown out? Some of your tanks in your group?
no, but I had some. Not any of my platoon tanks, but I was in a company where one of our tanks had hit an anti-tank mine, and it blew off the track. And luckily, nobody was hurt. But that was common, because up at the front, the area had been heavily mined, and so it's nothing at all like this thing about worrying about an automobile being bombed to blow up like in Iraq. But back then, they wouldn't devise bombs that were so big that it would throw the tank up in the air and down. It would just disable it. So,
Larry, why do they refer to Korea as the Forgotten War?
it's not forgotten by me, I can tell you that. Well, that's sort of hard to put my finger on. Sometimes I look back at like the Spanish-American War and wonder, well, why did we go to war about that? So if you're not living at the time, and it's going back into history, it's easy to forget. And we had followed so closely World War II, which was a very huge war. Everybody just about in the world was involved in that one. And so Korea they started out calling it a police action. And people who didn't know anyone who was in Korea, you went on with life as usual, sort of like we do now with the Iraq War. If you don't know somebody that's over there, you're say, well, gee, that's terrible, what's happening. But I guess if it isn't your bull that's being gourded, you don't worry about it as much as if it's really happening to you. So.
Well, I think it's important that we remember some of these things, and that's why we're talking today. As a veteran and an American citizen, Larry, tell me about freedom. What does freedom mean to you?
Well, to me, we accomplished a number of things in the Korean War, and I guess the first most important one was that we restored the sovereignty of South Korea. This was a nation that had been overrun by military means by the North Koreans. And it was a real test of the United Nations. Are we going to do something about it, or are we just going to sit back and say, well, let somebody else take care of it, or we're not going to worry about it? And I think that World War II and how Hitler had come to power was so fresh in our memories that we didn't want anything like that to happen again. And communism was the big threat. So, one, we restored sovereignty for the South Koreans, which is sort of a moral issue. Here people had been enslaved, or would have been, and a lot of them more would have been killed and murdered if we hadn't stepped in. Then Chinese, the Chinese communist country became a world power after the Korean War. And then a third thing, the Soviet Union ceased to be a great world power. They started declining, and which was a wonderful thing because we felt that was the big threat to our way of life and our freedom was the communist threat. So that was diminished. Unfortunately, there's other threats that keep coming up through history. And I guess to go back to China, before Korea, they had undergone civil war. They really in World War II, they weren't too much help. But we came to their aid because the Japanese had invaded them and conquered them.
Well, let me ask another question here. As we're getting near the end here, what does the American flag mean and represent to you as a veteran?
Oh, it brings tears to my eyes sometimes when I see it. And a while back, I was participated in a parade, a St. Patrick's Day parade, and there's a Korean War Veterans Association with chapters in the Denver area, and I went to one of the chapter meetings, and I rode in the parade. We were just on like a little trailer that was pulled, and we had the American flag in front of us, and what really impressed me were all of the spectators that would, they'd come up and say, thank you for what you did in Korea. And that was really moving to me. They'd come up and shake our hands, you know, and pat us on the shoulder, and it just was a wonderful feeling. It just was very moving to me.
That's good to hear. Yes, sir. Larry, just a couple more questions. What do you think people should remember about Korea and the Korean War?
Well, I think the main thing is that the United States is a world power, and whether we like it or not, it's our responsibility to support the United Nations as much as possible. And at the time when Truman sent troops into Korea, I was scared, you know, because when you're the one that's going to go over there, you think, oh, gee, I wish that wasn't going to happen. But looking back on it with a lot of years in between, I think that he did the right thing because, one of the other things that the war did, I think that it was the beginning of the downfall of the world communist movement. From then on, things went downhill, and now communism is not much of a threat to us. And it sure was back after World War II. So.
It was, yeah. Just one more quick question about the tanks and what you were doing in combat. What were your targets, and how did how did you determine your targets and how effective were you at destroying them?
Well, that's a good question. The Chinese had ample time during the peace talks to really construct defensive positions. They had tunnels that they had blasted into the mountainside, and they had their artillery pieces on railroad tracks where they would pull their gun out and fire at us, and then before anything could happen to them, they would pull those guns back, and they would sort of go around in a curve, from what I've been told, in the mountain. So what we would do, we would watch, and as soon as enemy gun fired, we would take note of where it was. Then we would fire on that tunnel, and we'd get the exact azimuth for our tank, because the tank turret can be moved back and forth, and it can go up and down. So we would have a reading on exactly what we would need to put around in that tunnel entrance. And we'd leave our tank there. I mean, you wouldn't back it off, because then you'd be off. And so then we'd just be sitting there waiting. And if the Chinese would fire, we'd go at them, and on some occasions, we would knock out that tank, that gun, because they couldn't pull it out. I mean, they usually fire 3 rounds, and then they wanted to get the heck out of there, because they knew that all hell was going to break loose to get after them. So that was one thing that we did. Another thing, we would search for enemy bunkers, and sometimes all you could see of an enemy bunker was, you would be looking with your binoculars or through the tank gun sight, and you'd see just a little hole. I mean, it could be like the shadow cast by a bush. And every now and then, the Chinese would, they would cover the front of the aperture with canvas or some kind of cloth. But then every now and then they'd pull that cloth back so they could see what was going on. So you really had to be observant. But there was more than one occasion when I would see this canvas go up, and then I'd take that target under fire and blow it up, because you start putting 90mm tank rounds into an aperture about that big, and then when you see logs start falling down the mountainside, and especially if you would get what we'd call a secondary explosion, when our tank round would detonate the enemy's ammunition. And then that was a cause of great joy and celebration, because, we knew that the less ammunition they had, the less harm they could do to us.
Did you ever see any human wave attacks by the Chinese? Anything like that?
No, I was close to it one time. I didn't want to see it. It was such, it was near the end of the war, over where the Turk Brigade was, near Panmunjom, and the Chinese were wanting to overrun some of our outpost positions so they would be in a better bargaining position at the peace talks. And they didn't care how many lives they would expend, and they just keep coming at you. And we would have tanks up on line, and then we would have half tracks with quad 50 machine guns in between each tank. And we would be firing point blank at these Chinese that were coming at us from maybe a distance less than a football field away. and it was just a carnage. And of course, they were firing artillery at us, but we had a definite advantage because they didn't have tanks on line, because our Air Force and our artillery would have knocked them out. I never saw an enemy tank in action. I saw some that had been knocked out, but they would have been blown up long before they ever got down to the front. So did I answer your question? Sometimes I
don't think I'd want to see a human wave attack either. So
I saw some Chinese at a distance through a BC scope, which was a telescope that artillery forward observers use, and it's sort of like a periscope. You're looking at it here, and it goes up like that, and then turns. So you're not going to get shot in the head like you might if you're using binoculars. And so this Marine soldier pointed out to me, he said, every now and then there's a Chinese that just gets out and walks along this path, and would you like to see him? And I said, sure. So a little bit later, he said, well, there he is. So I saw him, and I took a movie of him through the BC scope. You can't tell what it is, but there's something sort of moving. And I guess he was like about 700 yards away. So another time I saw two Chinese get up and with a cross-cut saw cut down a tree. And I wanted to take the target under fire, but the tank that was in the position where it could do that had to pull back, and it was cleaning its gun. And so I kept telling the tank commander, I said, hurry up. Here are these guys, they cut the tree down there, they're cutting it up in pieces. So just as the tank pulled up into position, they'd finished doing their lumber work and disappeared.
So tell me about being notified of your daughter's birth, where you were in Korea, and how you were notified and how you felt about that.
Oh, that brings back such fond memories. I was well, a little bit earlier, I knew that my wife was due to have a baby in about the middle of November. So I had gone to the division Red Cross office to notify them that hey, I'm expecting to be a father, and be sure to let me know when you get the word, because I'd been told that's how they handle it, that it was through the Red Cross. So I did that, and then I was just working, out up near the Punch Bowl in Korea, and my roommate, who was we shared a tent, came to me, and he said they want to talk to you at company headquarters. So I thought, gee, I wonder if I've done something wrong. So I went up to it, and the fellow at the personnel office said, I've got some good news for you. And he gave me this piece of paper, and it said, red-haired daughter and mother doing fine, born November 17, 1972. Well, I was just overwhelmed, so I went to the Red Cross office and talked to the fellow that gave me some more information. And then I went to our Battalion PX, and I bought some candy and some cigars. And then I went out to my platoon, and I told them what had happened, and I said, here's some candy and some cigars. I've become a father. And then I had one of my sergeants, my platoon sergeant, take movies of me by my tent. And so I had this letter in my hand, and I was looking at the letter, and then I had a picture of my wife, about 8 by 10, and I had that in my hand, and you'll see it when you look at my DVD, because that's part of it. But it was just wonderful, and because I was worried about my wife. I mean, you know, when you're a young man and your wife gives birth the first time, it's a new thing for both of you, and you fear about the worst and hope for the best. But when I found out that she was okay, it was, oh, what a wonderful feeling. Yeah, so that's about it. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to do one more thing right at the end of the interview. I asked all the veterans this, but when I tell you, can you give me a salute into the camera when I ask you to?
Sure.
From where you're seated there?
Yeah.
Okay, Larry, right into the camera.
Okay.
Go ahead.